Hello and welcome to this video, and this video is going to be called The Greatest Jazz Fusion Album You Never Heard. And this is my third attempt at doing this video. I never do that normally. Normally I hit record and I start talking and it just happens. Whatever happens, happens. With this, it's just not happening today. I don't know why that is. I've been pretty ill over Christmas. I don't know, with my brain is not quite snapping into gear. It's not snapping into a train of thought that just flows. I need to try and find the flow, right? So here we are, third attempt. I thought I'm not going to do the same thing of just trying to get through my notes here. Let's just see what happens. Let's just see what talking, and let's actually, like some sort of Zen ninja, just go with the fact that I'm having difficulty finding the flow. Right, the flow state, any jazz musician will know exactly what I'm referring to when I mention flow. It's doesn't matter how much you've practiced, doesn't matter how much chops you've got, how much understanding you've got, right? There is a mysterious point where a musician can feel connected to something that is beyond our understanding, really. And when you feel connected, then it stops feeling like you're doing it and it feels like you're accessing something else and the music is flowing through you. This is one of the great things I think that people recognise when they listen to the jazz. People who like jazz, and I assume all you watching this video have clicked on it because you like jazz and you're searching for that new thing. What's Andy going on about? An album I've never heard of. Well, some of you may have heard it, but some of you may not, of course. I only put that there to get you to click on and watch this video. But for those of you who do know this album, you will be punching at the air, because this album has that tumbling, free feeling. Although it's so tightly composed, within that there feels an unboundless energy, a freedom within the music, which I think personifies what makes the best jazz and jazz fusion the best, which is why it's here. Now, why am I doing a video on it? Well, doing this channel, I get a lot of suggestions of other fusion I should listen to. A lot of it I already know and I don't like, or I like but I haven't got around to covering it. In some cases, in many cases, it's stuff I've never heard of before, and you click on it and you go, yes, pretty good, sounds like generic fusion. There's lots and lots of fusion around. It does start to make you think, why was this not successful? Maybe it was too derivative. There's a lot of this around at the time. Record labels tend to jump on a style, and those pioneers are the greats, and then they go and sign up loads and loads of other stuff and put it out there, and you get diminishing returns. This definitely happened to jazz fusion at the end of the 70s, as fusion moved from that sort of bombastic fusion of rock, especially progressive rock, and jazz, which is personified by the Return to Forever, the Mahavishnu Orchestras, the Weather Reports, the 11th Houses, all that sort of jazz rock, right? Jazz rock slowly turned into fusion. And fusion was something different. It wasn't just a fusion of jazz and rock. It was a fusion with jazz and commercial popular music. And towards the end of the 70s, a lot of jazz fusion artists, rather than trying to blow your mind with a sort of heady mixture of prog rock, Jimi Hendrix and Miles Davis, rather than trying to blow your mind with that psychedelic experience, they were trying to tap into the same formula that was giving groups like Earth, Wind and Fire and the Jacksons and all that. They're trying to, push something out with a cool groove and a nice hook that FM radio could play and you could get hits with. This album is definitely in that second category. So this is a real anomaly for me. I actually am not so keen on that period of jazz fusion. It's the period I call Fusack, and I'm not so keen on it, all right? And I know a lot of the people who come to hear me talk about jazz fusion will often suggest bands that play in that more Fusack realm. And this is a certain artist that has been suggested to me a number of times. Now, I'd never heard of this artist when I first got messages from my fans saying, check this guy out. So I didn't know anything about it. Most of the time when I click on a link like that, as I said, I'm hearing just generic fusion. In this case, I recognise something absolutely unique. And over the last year, I've been listening to this album more and more, and I've come to think that it is in one of the top 5, top 10 fusion albums of all time. And I think it's probably the greatest Fusack album ever made. And it is mind-blowing. And this is what makes it so unique and special. Shall I tell you what the album is? The album is Exhibition by John Serry Jr. This album came out in 1979 on the Chrysalis label. John Serry Jr. is the son of John Serry Sr., who was a famous accordionist in America, who'd come up in the 40s, I think. And he'd given his son a very, very strict sort of music education. And John Serry Jr. had not only studied piano and composition, but he'd also studied drums and percussion. And it really shows on this album. This album has such a strong rhythmical conception. So what are we really talking about with this album Exhibition? Well, let's go with this. It's composed, arranged and orchestrated by John Serry Jr. On one track he plays all the instruments, right? The playing on it is absolutely phenomenal. What it sounds like is a cross between late 70s Fusack, you know, bands like the Brecker Brothers, Spyro Gyra, because I try and wipe these bands from my memory. Who else would it be? Like the Yellow Jackets. It's that sort of more middle of the road, easy listening jazz fusion, very well played. You know that style of music? Imagine crossing that with a much more detailed, modern classical approach to composition. I've said elsewhere that this album sounds like Spyro Gyra, but arranged by Frank Zappa. Now that isn't just an allusion to the complexity on the album, it's the fact that the orchestral percussion is really featured on this, and there's a lot of sort of vibraphone and piano runs along very atonal melodies that give it as almost like a Frank Zappa sound. The percussionist on here, and sorry to have to refer to notes because I don't know this, the vibraphone, xylophone, bells, chimes, congas, timbales, percussion, played by Gordon Gottlieb. Now, Gordon Gottlieb was John Serry Jr.'s teacher at college. So this guy's brought in, and then he is playing alongside, on drums, the great Carlos Vega, the late great Carlos Vega, one of the great drummers of the Fusack period, an absolute genius drummer, who I felt had such a groove and concept, you know, very much along the same lines as someone like Steve Gadd, a strong Latin ability on the drums, but on most albums you never fully hear the full power of Carlos Vega. On here you do. This is like mind-blowing drumming. On bass we've got Jim Johnson and his brother Gordon Johnson. Of course, Jim Johnson went on to fame playing with a whole host of people, but people watch this channel probably Alan Holdsworth, we know. So you play for Alan Holdsworth, you're a good bass player, you know. So, but also his brother Gordon Johnson. They both play electric bass. I think Gordon's a little bit more known for acoustic bass playing. Bob Shepherd on saxophone. What else have we got? I think that's about it. Everything else is John Serry. The track Sabotage, which is probably the most brutal, you know, intense track on this album, was nominated for Grammy for Best Instrumental. And I think there's a track, like I said, is it called Just for Fun or something like that? I haven't got the track list here, where John Serry Jr. plays all the instruments, and he sounds exactly like all the other musicians on the band. It's quite astonishing. It's tightly recorded, it's dry, it's got that 70s fusion sound about it, a lot of analog synths, some incredible guitar from Barry Finnerty, who I didn't mention. Reading up on this album, one of the comments on one of the videos, somebody who knew John Serry had said that he'd hired two much more well-known jazz fusion guitar legends to play on this album, and then when they saw the charts and they saw the complexity involved, they balked and walked. You know, they couldn't take it. So Don't know whether that's true or not, but it is a testament to the complexity of this. And it's a certain type of complexity that you just don't hear on any other album. Because for all the atonal modern classicalness around this album, it's still always grooving and funky. It's so funky, it's so dry, it's so tight. Carlos Vega's drumming, he just turns on a fivepence. It's like he's so inside the arrangements. There's no indecision or feeling that this is troubling them in any way. They just sort of jump through these incredible hoops, and it is absolutely unrelenting. It's probably got more musical information on than most albums you will hear. It's equal in density to somebody like Frank Zappa or Cardiacs. It's that dense, but never does it step outside this beautiful jazz fusion setting. It's always catchy, it's always funky, it's always punchy. You know, in 1980, John Serry followed this album up with a album called Jazzy. Now, I've cheated a little bit, because I should call it the two greatest jazz fusion albums that you've never heard, but it's just not, doesn't make sense, the title. Jazzy is just as good, right? In terms of production, the production's a little bit more, a little bit better, I suppose, but I really like that sort of dry, thin 70s fusion production sound you got on Exhibition. I really love it. Jazzy is a little bit more opulent. The lineup is pretty similar, except as well as Carlos Vega, we have the great Peter Erskine on drums on a couple of the tracks, Jim Johnson and Gordon Johnson on bass, Gordon Gottlieb on percussion. This time we have Michael Sembello on guitar, another fantastic fusion guitarist, Bob Shepherd on saxophone. So it's very much a direct follow-up to Exhibition. You have to listen to them both. They are both equally incredible. Like I said, the Jazzy doesn't quite have anything equal to Sabotage in terms of brutal, intense fusion. That it's slightly mellower, but not much mellower, and it's probably got a richer production sound. It's not succumbed to some of the production stuff that you would get in the 80s. Later on, it's not like the 80s production spoil. It's a beautiful album. They're both incredible, and that's basically what I've come on here to tell you. If you know these two albums, you will be saying, yes, Andy, you're right, this is one of the greatest albums ever made. It's one of those things, if you go on YouTube and find somewhere where someone's streaming this album, you will just get comments after comments say this is one of the greatest albums ever made. And I'm going to be doing that this year. I think I'm going to be pointing fans of this channel to albums that I think are probably a little bit underrepresented, and try and point people, because I think this is what's really bad. I think that's what people come here for, is for that type of thing. He made a couple of albums after. He hasn't made that many albums. He's spent his time between, you know, being a musician, playing a lot on sort of film soundtracks and teaching. But a few years later, he made an album called The Enchantress, which is the same sort of compositional style, very complex, but it's much more acoustic based, and it's a very, very good, strong album. And then I think he makes an album with the Mondesi brothers, I think in the early 90s, called Shift. I've only listened to that a couple of times, and again, a lot more smaller arrangement approach, acoustic approach, but equally brilliant. This guy is a real genius that should get more mentioned. Yes, I can now correct myself, so I won't have to do it in the comments. That track, I've seen the bottom of my notes, that track off Exhibition, where John Serry plays all the instruments, is actually called Just for Kicks. What did I say it was called? Just for Fun? That's Jan Hammer. That's off Melodies, and that's another album that I'm probably going to have to come back to this year, I think. Melodies by Jan Hammer. That's an anomaly. You know, what other albums are there? What other albums should I be covering in this sort of, you know, series that I may or may not do this year? Who knows? Anyway, John Serry Jr., the greatest fusion album that no one's ever heard, you know, on a major label, Grammy nominations, and yet here I am, nearly, you know, a year and a half into doing this channel. It's the first time I've ever mentioned this album, which I would say should be in my top 10 lists, you know. I'm sure this year we're going to have to go back to my top 10 prog and my top 10 fusion albums at some point. I think that's going to be a yearly thing, because these lists, you know, what do they mean? Here we go. This just undermines the whole project, doesn't it, of having a channel where you have top 10 lists, you know, is that an album like this can come along. Anyway, I'm going to keep this one short. Exhibition 1979 by John Serry Jr. and Jazzy's 1980 by John Serry Jr. I'm putting in those as two of the greatest fusion albums ever made that you may or may not have heard. And if you haven't heard them, go and check them out now and tell me what you think in the comments below. And let's give a little bit of love back to these forgotten albums that should be up there with the classics. Okay, thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next video.